Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Todd Klindt's SharePoint Netcast number 158, recorded live Monday, May 20th, 2013. I am Todd Klindt, your host, and this year's winner of Billboard Magazine's Best Hair in SharePoint. The Billboard awards were last night. I came in first, Best Hair in SharePoint, and I'm all yours tonight. And as always, I have to thank my fine sponsors at Rackspace for all of the love that they're giving me. Tonight they paid for the hosting. If you're downloading this, you download it off of a Rackspace server. If you're wondering to yourself, where does Todd get all of these stylish duds? Rackspace. And you're probably wondering to yourself, why does Todd's water taste so good? It's coming out of a Rackspace cup. So you can go to rackspace.com/SharePoint and find out all about the great things that Rackspace can do for you for SharePoint and all your other hosting needs. Rackspace.com. Oh, right. So the first thing we always do every week is we start off with our production notes. And Jared in the chat room suggested that not only do I have a SharePoint netcast, but I should also just have a netcast of production notes of all the things that I screw up on my netcasts. I'm in the process now of kicking Jared out of the chat room. He needs to watch his mouth, show some respect. So production notes, we had a couple of things. I didn't get the RSS feeds for 155 or the blog post for 150 or 156 out very quickly. Those should all be out. Last week's 157 got rendered. I had a couple of little technical difficulties, and so I just need to get those out. But that'll be out hopefully in the next couple of days. Also having problems, you'll probably notice that my fancy microphone is sitting back there instead of sitting right here, not in my lap, but right on the table here in front of me. It's because every time I turn it on and my webcams, it starts to crackle. So that was the crackling problem that we had a couple of weeks ago. It seems to be, again, a USB bus issue, so I'm still investigating that. But for now, I'm using the microphone on that webcam right there. Seems to be working pretty well, so we'll stick with that until I can get that the camera worked out. But myriad of things, technical difficulties for me to work on here. Keeps me hopping, keeps me on my toes. But we're winding them down. We're making progress. Stick with me. On a production note, sort of. Here in the last week or two, YouTube opened up this whole YouTube streaming thing, kind of like a Google Hangout, but it's like live TV on YouTube. In order to be able to stream live on YouTube, though, you need to have 1,000 followers on your YouTube channel. So last time I checked, I had a touch over 100. So if every one of you that is subscribed to my YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/Todd Klindt Netcast, and if I'm smart, when I edit this out, I'll put that right down here. This is my visual cue for putting it here. youtube.com/Todd Klindt Netcast. And if every one of you that is subscribed to my channel only gets 9 other people, just 9, that's it, to subscribe to my channel, that will put me over 1,000, and then I can try the broadcasting live on YouTube. So give that a shot. That's youtube.com/Todd Klindt Netcast, and we'll try that out if we get enough people. Okay, on to this week's topics. I have got a bunch of topics tonight. Holy cow, my notes are packed. And a couple of hours ago, I started not having any idea what to talk about. It's really fallen together. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is broken SharePoint. Added a couple of new regressions to my builds lists last week, so I thought I'd call those out to you guys today. The first one is the regression with the April 2013 CU to SharePoint 2010. And this is an issue. After you install the April 2013 CU to SharePoint 2010, you might get a security validation error when you try to save a page that has managed metadata fields embedded in them. So I've got a link where you can read about that. And so I've added that to the list of regressions for that particular batch. Shout out to Trevor Seward for that one. So if you have not installed the April 2013 cumulative update for SharePoint 2010, probably better hold off on that one for a while. And on a somewhat related note, the April 2013 CU for SharePoint 2013 isn't so hot either. I don't know if there's like an April Fool's joke in here that I just haven't made yet, but both of the April 2013 CUs seem to have a little bit of dust in them still. So the other regression that I added to my list is in the December 2012 CU for SharePoint 2010. And that is a great new feature that they add with that patch, that after you install that patch, some of your workflows get stuck in starting and they can't stop. So that's a good one. I do like those. I don't know if that's been fixed. I haven't chased that one down yet or not, but that's with the December 2012 CU for SharePoint 2010. And that one, thanks go out to Brian McCullough on Twitter for giving me a shout on that one. You can follow him at twitter.com/bpmccullough on their common spelling. So got those out there. So always, as I always tell you, don't install a Cumulative update unless you need it. And then if you do install it, install it in a test environment, kick the tires a little bit, let it run for a month or two before you unleash it on your users, because they will absolutely positively find every little problem. And as we all know, you can't uninstall these Cumulative updates, so you're kind of stuck with them until the next Cumulative update comes out, which, as we all know, will fix the problem that the previous one added, but will replace it with 3 more of equal or worse severity. So be careful for that. And then also just kind of a reminder that the April 2013 CU for SharePoint 2013 is kind of a non-starter, kind of a bad deal. It's got this weird bug where it, when you're running the configuration wizard afterwards, it fails out because it can't find a document library that's never existed. Good stuff there. So I wouldn't necessarily put that one on yet. So if you find any regressions with SharePoint patches, and we've got a couple people in the chat room who've been chatting about that since we went online here, go ahead and send them to me on Twitter. I'm Todd Klindt on Twitter, or you can email me todd.klindt@rackspace.com. And if you've got a link or a blog post or something like that, or a couple of these were TechNet forum things, send it to me, and if I check it out and all that and it looks good, I'll make you a star. I'll give you a shout out in the Netcast. That makes everybody famous, and then I'll add it to my list. And then your fellow SharePoint administrators will be in awe of you. They will appreciate all the hard work that you did by letting me update my regressions list. So, and if you want to keep on top of the regressions and find them just as quickly as I find them or publish them, you can follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/sp2010patches. And so that's obviously for SharePoint 2010, or twitter.com/sp2013patches. And every time a new patch comes out, or I add a regression or whatever, anytime I futz with any of the 2010 or 2013 build stuff, I tweet it there, so you can find out all the new stuff from that. And people in the chat room are like, what about these CUs? A couple of you've got it figured out. This stuff's how I get to eat these bugs and stuff, are what put food on the table. Got to put my kids through college, so go easy on Microsoft on these. Okay, so another one. This one I wanted to give a shout out to Mike Robbins on Twitter. Mike taught a PowerShell class at SQL Saturday in Atlanta on Saturday, and he said he pointed a bunch of people here. So thanks to Mike for doing that, and welcome to anybody from Mike's PowerShell class. I am going to be talking about PowerShell in this netcast, and that's not just for Mike. I was really going to do it anyway. So. I've talked about this particular one before, which makes it particularly fun that it got me twice. But I was running somebody else's PowerShell script, and I was a good SharePoint administrator, and I read through the script ahead of time. This particular script that I'm running, this PowerShell script that I'm going to talk about, was a few thousand lines long, and it referenced a XML file, pulled values in. It was over 10,000 lines long, so this was some tough stuff. But it was a script that automated some building things. And part of what this script did was it verified that the service accounts that I was going to use actually existed, which is good. This is a good idea. But it kept telling me that they didn't exist, except I know they existed. They were right there. I could see them. I was even logged in as one at the time. and it said that the script was failing. So broke into the code. Now, normally when I'm doing stuff with Active Directory users in PowerShell, I use the PowerShell commandlet get-ad user. So when I validate users, that's what I do. Get AD user, sp_farm. It kicks me back, tells me if it's true or not. When I ran that, those all came back true. So I broke into the script, and the script was doing things a little better, except that it didn't work, but a little better in that it was not just validating that the user existed, but it was using a different method. It was using reflection to pull out a method that was actually verifying that the password was correct also. So not just that the user existed, but that the user had the password that the script thought it had, and that's where it was failing. So Vlad in the chat room brings up an interesting point. I am not talking about AutoSP installer, and I'm not being coy. I really am not. The thing that I am talking about, I'm going to cover in a couple of future netcasts once I get everything figured out. Brian Laland said is not at fault here. This is not AutoSP installer. And Jared in the chat room is trying to spoil my big reveal. So, and this was an environment that somebody else had set up and created all the accounts. So it took me a while to figure out, but what had happened was this was a test environment, and normally when I set up a test environment, my default password is pass@word1. These guys had $$ word. And as we all know, the $sign in PowerShell is a variable, and specifically $$ is a variable for whatever was typed last on the command line. So their XML file that had their values in it had the password defined in it. This thing was bringing it out, and then was trying to compare $$ to the thing that was in AD. Obviously, it didn't match up. And I bring this up to, number one, to raise awareness. As far as I know, there's no like ribbon campaign on Facebook, don't have passwords with $signs in them. There's nothing like that. There's no marches. This is my way of bringing awareness to it. But the other thing is there are some ways to code around this. If you use single quotes instead of double quotes, single quotes tell PowerShell not to resolve variables, so that's one way around it. That wouldn't have necessarily worked in this environment because of the way they were pulling the variable out. But the other reason that I wanted to bring it up is because of how I troubleshot it. And the way that I did that is I found the place in the code where it was doing, doing the comparison, and then right before it failed, I just put a breakpoint in, and I just hit enter in the PS1 file, typed the word break, saved it, reran it. So the script ran till that point, and then just kicked back out to PowerShell, and then I could easily just see what all my variables equal to. Now, if you're using some kind of fancy integrated scripting environment, like Idera's PowerShell Plus, that gives you a register on the right where you can see where all your variables are set to, that would have worked too. But I just, it's just a text file, so I just dropped a break in there, and so as soon as I saw what the password was, it was trying to do, I'm like, ugh, this is like the third time I've fallen for this. You got me again, PowerShell. But that's another one. So, shout it out to the command prompt there. Lo and behold, the password was all junked up. Changed the password to something without $signs in it, and it tore off. So that's just my public service announcement. Don't use $signs in passwords, and make sure that you use the correct, single quote as opposed to double quote, because that'll mess a fella up. Even somebody who plays with PowerShell every day like I do, and even somebody who's done this exact same thing in PowerShell before, still trip you up. But if you went to Mike Robbins' PowerShell class, you're probably too smart. You probably knew this already. You're probably like Jared in the chat room shouting it out. The password had a $sign in it. Yep, that's what it was. Another one that I wanted to bring up, and this one was mentioned to me today, and this is a good example. Now that we've had PowerShell for a couple of versions of SharePoint, it's really time to start weaning ourselves off of STS-ADM. Number one, it's just not cool. All your hipster SharePoint buddies are all making fun of you if you're not using PowerShell. It's just, you don't want to not be cool in front of your buddies. So using STS-ADM when you don't have to is just, it's just not cool. Second of all, if there's something that you can do in STS-ADM and in PowerShell, every time I'm going to think the PowerShell version works better. It's going to be updated more, it's going to be tested more, things like that. And it had an example, reminded me of an example today, and this was somebody who was moving site collections from one content database to another in SharePoint 2010. and they were using STS-ADM merge content DBs. Now, when this came out with SharePoint 2007 Service Pack 1, it was the greatest thing ever, and I loved it. I used it a lot. But then when SharePoint 2010 came out, we had this new PowerShell commandlet, move SP site, which does the same thing, only better because it's PowerShell. This particular customer, they were using STS-ADM, and it should have worked, but there were 3 little letters that tripped STS-ADM up. Jared in the chat room, do you know what those 3 letters are? You seem to be the chat room smarty pants tonight. We'll let the lag catch up. Lag catch up. No. Okay, so the 3 letters that tripped up STS-ADM were R, B, and S. So, starting with Service Pack 1 with SharePoint 2010, and honestly probably before it, Move SP Site understood RBS and understood what was happening when you were moving things in and out. But STS-ADM doesn't handle it very well. And so when they used STS-ADM to move their site collection into or out of it, I can't remember which direction it was, but it didn't handle the RBS bit very well, and it kind of just crapped out. So had they been using PowerShell, and the Move SP Site commandlet, starting with Service Pack 1, actually has an RBS parameter now. So if you have multiple RBS providers in your destination database, you can specify which one your new content goes into. So again, if you can use PowerShell, and don't use STS-ADM. Okay, so this one was one, this next topic that comes up. This one is one that somebody left as a comment on my blog today, and I was just too lazy to reply in the comment field yet, so I'm going to do it tonight on the Netcast. But basically they were asking what the pros and cons were of letting SharePoint create all of your databases for you or pre-creating them in SQL. And this is one of those that the correct answer depends a lot on what kind of environment you have, what your role is in your environment, and what kind of resources you have. So, and in the comment on my blog, they asked for the pros and cons. Well, really the pros for one or the cons for the other. So I'm just going to talk about the pros to each one. So if you let SharePoint create your databases for you, and let's be clear, I'm not talking about doing this with the dumb wizards. I'm not talking about the gray wizard or the white wizard. I'm talking about going into central admin and specifying a content database for your web app, or using PowerShell or whatever. The pros are that as the SharePoint administrator, you can do it. You don't have to wait for somebody on the SQL team to do it. So if you're a distributed shop, you can just do it inside of the application. It's just done right away. The other thing that it does is it's a great gut check that everything works fine. If you try to create a database in SharePoint and it won't create, chances are you've got permission problems in SQL somewhere, or SQL's gunked up somehow or something. So creating your databases in SharePoint is just one more thing to make you feel better about SQL and SharePoint's their communication skills. If it doesn't work, maybe we send them to a therapist or something. They use some techniques to try to figure out how to communicate better. But those are a couple of the big benefits, that everything gets created correctly, or everything works to correct things. But the other thing is, if you create a database in SharePoint, that database is created in the best way that SharePoint wants it. You know that SharePoint's got everything in there. Any settings that SharePoint cares about, like collation or anything like that, are set correctly. That's the case when you do it from SharePoint. So those are kind of the pros for that. That is the best situation if you can do it. If you're a one-man shop and you control everything, it's probably, or a one-person shop as we say now, it's probably a pretty good way to do it. The other option is to pre-create your databases in SQL and then point SharePoint at them after the fact. So the pros for this one are that you have better control over things. So I said that one of the pros for creating them in SharePoint was that SharePoint set all the settings that it cared about correctly, and it does. But there are a whole bunch of other SharePoint or SQL settings that SharePoint doesn't care a lick about, and it just ignores them. And in those cases, it might guess the wrong answer. For instance, when you create the database in SharePoint, you can't tell it where on the SQL file system to store the MDF or the LDF files. You just don't have that flexibility because SharePoint doesn't care where it's at. If you create your databases in SQL, you have that flexibility. You can say, the data file goes on D and the log files go on L. Now you're probably saying to yourself, well, I just set those defaults on my SQL instance and then that happens automatically, which is good. That's good. You should do that. But if you've got multiple drive locations, let's say you want your search databases on one set of spindles and all that kind of stuff, then you can't just use the defaults. But if you create the databases in SQL, then you have that flexibility. The other thing that you can do, and there's a whole bunch of those settings that you can do. The other thing is if you've got a big SQL environment and you've got things like backup jobs that databases need to be added to, or mirrors that need to be created, or always on availability groups that your databases need to be added to. If you create those databases in SQL and get that all squared away, then as soon as SharePoint starts talking to them, you're good to go. So that's another pro. Another pro is that if you lost my train of thought. If you create your databases in SQL before you touch them with SharePoint, then it's going to be a little quicker when things happen, because maybe when you created them in SQL, maybe you pre-grew them to a gig or something like that. And when you're creating new content databases and new web apps in SharePoint, part of that long period that you're waiting is the creation of the databases. So that saves you some time. So we got an interesting discussion in the chat room. Jeff Jones is saying, can't the SQL model database help with some of those defaults? Yes, it does with some, but SharePoint is remarkably dumb about that and doesn't follow all of the settings in the model database in SQL. And Vlad brings up one of the worst ones is the auto grow setting. It completely ignores that. For those of you that haven't played in SQL, the model DB is one of the system databases, so by default it's hidden in SQL Server Management Studio. But you can set a bunch of settings inside of that model database, and when new databases are created, if parameters are not specified, the database engine just looks to see how the model is that database is configured, and it just copies that. It's a model for the new databases. SharePoint does use some of those settings but doesn't use the others, so it's kind of a crapshoot. And I do have an old blog post on that from 2010 or 2007 about that, and that hasn't changed much. So those are kind of the pros and the cons. I've been in a couple situations where this has come up with customers. In one situation, a customer had a bunch of content databases that they wanted to build out. They had some very specific locations that they wanted their service app databases and that kind of thing. So we scripted the whole thing in T-SQL and just built all the databases out. And so that was great because they went on different spindles. We just had this T-SQL script that we just ran, poof, it blew through them all. And then when we hooked them up with SharePoint, the process is exactly the same in SharePoint if the database exists or not. SharePoint's none the wiser, except it hooks up and the database is already there and things just go more quickly. So that was one success story with pre-creating the databases. With another customer, they were an incredibly secure environment and they had the SQL permissions locked down within an inch of their lives. And they created the databases in SQL because they had taken away the permission for SharePoint to create databases in SQL, so you just couldn't do it any other way. And I was not a fan of that, and I fought that, and kind of got into some heated, we'll say, discussions with the customer about that. Because my thought was, if you've taken away permission for SharePoint to do this particular action, create databases, what other things might not work? Not being able to create a database is not the problem so much as it's the symptom of the problem, and that symptom is the SharePoint accounts don't have enough permission. So if that's why your SQL folks want to pre-create the databases so they can take permissions away, I'm not a fan of that. But if they're doing it to keep things more tidy, it's probably okay. In the chat room and in the show notes, I've got a link to a SharePoint 2010 knowledge base article that walks you through how to deploy DBA created databases so the SharePoint 2010 and 2013 can use them. So a good question about that. I will point that person to this blog or this Netcast. Okay, so here's another one, looking at the time here. Here is another one. Oh, I'm going to talk about PowerShell first. So one of my coworkers, Stephen Wilson, has a blog, SharePointBitMe.com, and he had a blog post a couple of days ago that was pretty good, that I liked. And it was about how to use PowerShell to check whether a Windows patch is installed on a box or not. So he walks through using it. He creates a COM object for the Windows Update stuff, and then you get a list of the patches down. I'll let Steven's blog post speak for itself, but I did want to add one thing to it. So he talks about doing this and getting this whole list of patches and filtering out the title and spitting it out to a text file and then being able to go through that. And that's fine. That works great. The times in the past I've used this has been to check for a specific KB number. So I'm looking for a patch, KB123456. I've done the same thing, but then at the end I've just done a where clause, and I've said, I've done the same thing that Steven does in his blog post, but then at the end, instead of piping it out to a text file or something, I've just said where object title like, and then the KB article that I'm looking for. And then if it's installed on that system, poof, it pops up. And if not, then I know that I need to install it. But that's a great use for PowerShell, especially when you've got these the forgotten prerequisites that you have to install on the OS. It's a good sanity check to make sure that they've been installed. Okay, so this was another question that I had come across here today, was when you're creating workflows in SharePoint, and this is 2010, 2013, doesn't matter, you have 3 or 4 options on how to create these workflows. And this person was just wondering what my guidance was on telling people which of the many ways to create workflows they should go with. And so this is this is when you've got this great idea in your head for a workflow, and you need to make it reality. You've got this masterpiece in your head, you need to get it out. There are basically 3 main ways to do that. The first one, and this is that whole crawl, walk, run paradigm that we talk about. And in this case, crawling is just using the out-of-the-box workflows. So depending on which version of SharePoint you have, 2010 or 2013, and which SKU you have, Foundation or Server or Project Server or whatever, you have different workflows that are attached to different lists out of the box. And that's the easiest way. You just do it in the browser, you go to a list, you pick workflows, you associate a workflow, you tinker with some settings, and off you go. That might be all you need. That's crawling. That's very easy. And if you've got like a simple approval thing, that's probably enough. Probably enough to do. That's the crawling. Once you get past that, then you're ready to do your walking. And the way that you do your walking is you do that with SharePoint Designer. So even though you can't design with SharePoint Designer anymore, you can still use it for SharePoint, which is nice that they've left that in. But one of the main things you do with SharePoint Designer is create workflows. And so that's kind of the next step. So now you create, you go into SharePoint Designer, you attach to a web, you attach to a list, you go into the workflow settings, and you can actually build your own workflow. You've got a lot more flexibility here. You can pick actions, you can set your filters and that kind of stuff, and you can bring a lot more things to life that way. A little more advanced than crawling and more flexibility, a little more work, but that's kind of the next step. Is if you can't do it with an out-of-the-box workflow, then you fire up SharePoint Designer, go in there and start making some magic that way. Now, for a very few folks, that's not going to be enough yet. They're going to need to get their workflow nerd on, and they want to go to the next level. They want to go to running. And the way that you run with workflows in SharePoint is to fire up Visual Studio. Now, understand that if you fire up Visual Studio, all of your friends are going to think you're a developer. And they're probably right. So you do sacrifice a little bit of your soul when you use Visual Studio to create workflows. But if you got to get the job done and SharePoint Designer won't do it, you might have to make that sacrifice. But once you get into Visual Studio with your workflows, now you've got the entire C# framework to work with, and pretty much you can do anything you want to do because you're just developing. You're writing regular workflows. But now you've got to package it and distribute it and all that. So it really gets way more complicated. But that's the next step. If you're in SharePoint Designer and you can't figure out how to do what you need to do, working up to Visual Studio is the next step. And with SharePoint 2013, you can actually take your SharePoint Designer workflows and bring them into Visual Studio so you can move on that way. So that's kind of thing. Now that's the way. Now there is kind of a third and a half step to all of this. And this question was very fortuitous because I had a cool blog post that I was trying to think of a way to share without blatantly advertising for Rackspace, but I just didn't want to do that. But then I got this question. So The other thing that you can do is there are a couple of major you can expand workflow actions. So when you're in SharePoint Designer and you're picking your things, these are .action files and they're code that somebody wrote. And you can add third-party actions to your workflows. A couple of big players in the field for SharePoint. My favorite is Nintex. I know a bunch of the guys that work at Nintex. They make a great product and their support is great. I can't say enough good things about Nintex. So anytime anybody comes to me and they say, I'm looking for some extra workflow oomph for SharePoint, who should I look at first? Nintex is always the folks that I talk about. They're, like I said, I got some close personal friends. And with a lot of software these days, when I'm looking at recommending software to people, support is a huge thing for me now, because software works or it doesn't. You can't really help that. Nobody's perfect. But what a company does when something doesn't work is really what's telling for me. And I know a couple of guys at Nintex, and they seem to have like this unwritten rule there: don't be a jerk. And so that's actually come up a couple of times where I emailed somebody on behalf of a customer. Customer was having a licensing issue or something with Nintex. And so I emailed the guys at Nintex that I know, Mike Fitzmaurice being one of them, and said, hey, I got a customer who's doing this thing. Can they get a license to get around this one particular issue? And I loved it. And in one email, Fitz emailed me back. He's like, absolutely, we'll take care of them. We'd be jerks if we didn't. And they absolutely took care of them. And it was a great experience. So I love the guys at Nintex. But back to that. And that was not a paid advertisement for Nintex. Kind of felt like it was, but it wasn't. One of the things that you can do now with Nintex is they've really embraced this whole cloud thing. So they've got this whole cloud infrastructure that you can do Nintex workflows, and you can do crazy stuff with Nintex workflows. Send tweets and all kinds of crazy stuff. One of the things that they recently added now is if you want to create a Rackspace server, like a cloud server, like an infrastructure server, you can now do that with a Nintex workflow. They actually have a workflow object now where you can add an item to a list in your on-premises or whatever SharePoint environment, and it talks to our Rackspace cloud servers and creates a cloud server on your account as part of your workflow. Crazy stuff. So this is kind of the third and a half thing for workflows, is if you're crawling, you're doing your out-of-the-box stuff, that's not enough. You're in SharePoint Designer and you're close, you've got almost everything that you need. But not quite enough. That's when you start looking at third-party folks like Nintex or K2 or whoever, and if you buy their stuff, it's going to bolt into SharePoint Designer, it's going to bolt into the out-of-the-box stuff, and that kind of keeps you from having to fire up Visual Studio. And there are others out there. There's, I think there's a Codeplex project called I Love SharePoint that adds some workflow actions. So that's, I guess that's kind of 2.5 in the middle there. But that's the speech that I tell folks when they say, what should I use for workflow? All right, enough about that. Finally, this thing just came across the wire, just made it in before I went on the air, and I'm super excited about this. This is the answer to a question that I've gotten probably 10 times in the past 6 months. I've got this great blog post on SkyDrive Pro. It's like my second most popular blog post on my blog, maybe my third most popular. But one of the questions I get a lot is, how can I install the SkyDrive Pro Client by itself? Out of the box, the SkyDrive Pro Client comes with Office 2013. But I've had numerous people say, we can't roll Office 2013 out, we're stuck with Office 2010, or we don't want to run Office at all, but we want SkyDrive Pro, where can we get the installer? And up until like 3 hours ago, my answer to them was always, I'm sorry, here's a tissue, there's going to be some crying, but you can't do it. And the closest thing you can do to it is you can download the Office 2013 trial, install everything or install something, get the SkyDrive Pro client, and then uninstall the stuff, but leave the SkyDrive Pro client. It was horrendous. But as of about 3 hours ago, I saw on Microsoft's website you can now download standalone the SkyDrive Pro client. So hooray, no downloading this big ISO for that. And more importantly, you can install the SkyDrive Pro client alongside of Office 2007 or Office 2010. So you don't have to upgrade Office if you've got an older version. And if you don't have any version, then it'll just work. So this is awesome. This should have been out 6 months ago. Microsoft should have done this from the beginning. But that's awesome. So I've been saying for months that I need to update my SkyDrive Pro blog post, and this might be the thing that puts me over the edge, because this was pretty cool. So thanks to Microsoft for that. Okay, so now we are on to my favorite part of the Netcast, the shameless self-promotion part of the Netcast. So again, the first thing you need to do before you do anything is go out to youtube.com/Todd Klindt Netcast. Get subscribed to that so I can get to my 1,000 users so I can try their live thing. So the next thing is everybody, and I've seen some people in the chat room discussing it, talking about their favorite parts and how excited they are about it, how they can't wait for the sequel. If you don't have professional SharePoint 2013 administration yet, you need to get it. And the funny thing is, I actually don't have one within arm's reach here. They're all sitting out there in a box. So pretend that there's a very handsome looking book right here with an airplane cockpit on it. And if you don't have one, you should order one. You can go to my blog and you can see my blog post about it. And that's at toddklindt.com/pro-sp2013 admin. And that talks about, it gives you Amazon links and all that kind of stuff. If you want to order an autographed copy of the book, you can order it from me at that same link. There's a link. You can use PayPal, and I will sign whatever you want in it. I will put disparaging things about Shane in it. And a couple of people in the chat room have ordered those books. I've put disparaging things about their coworkers in it. Everybody wins. So if you want that, you can order that from my blog, and you can get that to you, and I'll send that out to you. The other thing is, if you have a copy of the book, what will do me a bunch of good and a bunch of help is to go out to Amazon and do a review. Now, I would expect most of the reviews would be positive because the book is awesome, if I do say so myself. But go out there, let the rest of the folks in the world know what you think of the book. Amazon's reviews are huge. They get a lot of weight. I see a bunch of you have already gone out there and done that. I appreciate that. Much love for that. Literally, without exaggeration, the publisher pesters us once a week about that. Go out there. Well, how come we don't have any reviews? Let's get some reviews. You guys suck. Where are the reviews? That kind of stuff. So if you don't mind, take a couple of minutes, go out there, give us a review, and be sure to talk about how I am much better looking than Shane when you give your review. That gives it more weight. Okay, the next thing is in a couple of weeks. We got Tech Ed in North America. You can go to northamerica.msteched.com to sign up for that. That is June 3rd through the 6th in New Orleans. On June 2nd, I'm doing a SharePoint 2013 installation and configuration pre-conference session. Please sign up for that. Looks like it's crowded. I don't know how many seats there are before it's sold out, but I got an email today. There's a bunch of you going to be there. Can't wait to meet each and every one of you. So go out there. Then Thursday morning, I'm doing another session as well. Also, for those of you that saw me on Windows Weekly a couple of months ago, Leo Laporte's show, there's going to be, unrelated to me, well, sort of unrelated to me, but Paul and Mary Jo are having a Windows Weekly tweet up at the Avenue on St. Charles Street, Monday night, and that's from 4 to 6 or something like that. Follow Mary Jo Foley on Twitter, or else I retweeted it this morning. But I plan on being there, hanging out with those guys, so if you want to hang out with those guys, you can do that too. And then a couple weeks after that, if you are in Europe or Asia, or just like to go to Spain, I will also be at MS Tech Ed in Europe, in Madrid, Spain. That's the last week of June. You can go to europe.msteched.com and sign up for that. And then in August, I will be at SP TechCon. And you can go to sptechcon.com and sign up for that. I am mistyping the URL in the chat window right now. If you haven't signed up for SP TechCon yet, you can use my last name, Klindt, as a promotional code. I don't think that gets you anything other than my undying gratitude, but I do appreciate that. And I know that I've become a big deal when my last name is a promotional code now, so I do feel very good about that. And finally, I got word from Hilton Giesenau, the guy that does the Moss Show. Apparently, your pleas to him have been answered. He emailed me today and said he's almost finished editing the episode that I recorded with him a couple of weeks ago, and that should be out next week. So thanks to Hilton for that, and thanks to all of you for pestering him. I can only imagine how much work it took to not to make me look not stupid. I mean, it's probably a day and night job. I know how tough it is for me when just editing this. So Hilton's got his work cut out for him. So thanks to Hilton for that. So that is everything tonight, folks. Once again, I've gone over. I appreciate all of your time. Thanks for the questions. A couple of these things were things that you guys sent in. I appreciate that. And as always, you can go to toddklindt.com/netcast. You can sign up for the RSS feeds there. I've got video, I've got audio, I've got claymation. I might have made that last part up, and also the YouTube channel. So however you want to consume this thing, hopefully I've got a version for you. Thanks to everybody. I will not be doing a Netcast next week. In the U.S., it is Memorial Day. I plan on going out and doing something crazy, getting stupid drunk and being passed out in a pile in my yard. Okay, that's all made up too. But Monday I'm probably going to be doing some family stuff. You guys should be out doing some family stuff. So I will not be doing a Netcast on Memorial Day. Plan on doing something after that. So thanks to everybody. Have a good week, and I'll talk to you later.